The heavy air inside my grandfather's study carried the scent of old wood, tobacco, and time itself. Sunlight sneaked through the half-drawn curtains, cutting sharp golden lines across the dark mahogany desk. I stood there, my palms damp, my heart restless, when he finally looked up from the papers in front of him. His deep, commanding voice broke the silence. "So, tell me," he said, eyes narrowing, "how do you spend your $3 million trust fund?" For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him right. $3 million what? I laughed awkwardly, expecting him to clarify, maybe make a joke. But Grandpa's stare didn't soften. It was the same expression that had terrified businessmen, ministers, even his own children, a look that demanded truth. "Sir, I managed, I don't have a trust fund." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and tapped the end of his walking cane on the marble floor. "That's interesting," he murmured, "because I have documents that say otherwise." The words hit me harder than a punch. My chest tightened. For 28 years, I'd fought my way through life, 2 jobs at once, rent overdue, chasing freelance work, skipping meals when money ran out. And now this old man, my grandfather, whom I barely visited, was asking how I spent millions. I wanted to protest, but his silence told me not to. He motioned toward the table beside him, where a thick brown envelope sat. My name was neatly typed across it in bold letters, Aminu Bello Trust Fund. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Inside were pages, legal documents stamped, sealed, and signed. I scanned them quickly. An account number, a bank's logo I recognized, investment statements dating back years. The total balance made my stomach twist. $3 million US. This can't be real. I whispered. Grandpa didn't answer. He just stared, a faint smirk touching the corner of his mouth, the kind of look a lion gives after watching a cub stumble. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" He finally spoke, slow and deliberate. "Because wealth is not a gift, my boy. It's a test, and I wanted to see what you'd become without it." His words chilled me. A test. All those years of hardship struggling to pay tuition, begging landlords for extra time, all while my own blood had locked away a fortune in my name. I stepped back, anger mixing with confusion. "That's cruel." "Cruel?" he repeated softly. "You think struggle is cruelty. No, Aminu, struggle reveals character. Money only exposes it." The silence between us grew heavy again. He looked out the window toward the vast gardens beyond the mansion. The setting sun painted his silver hair in amber light. "Now," he said, turning back to me, "the time has come. The fund is yours, but not yet in your hands. Tell me, if I gave it to you today, how would you spend it?" I couldn't answer. My mind went blank. He nodded knowingly. Exactly what I feared. He rose slowly, resting on his cane, and walked past me toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and said quietly, "You have 1 week to think. Return with an answer that proves you're not just another greedy heir." The door shut behind him, leaving me alone with the envelope and 1,000 questions clawing inside my head. The mansion felt colder after he left, like his words had sucked the warmth out of the air. I stood there for minutes, maybe hours, staring at the envelope on the desk. $3 million. The number echoed in my head like thunder. If this was a joke, it was a cruel one. If it was real, I didn't even know what that meant. I finally walked out into the corridor. The walls were lined with black and white portraits, my grandfather in his youth, his wives, his business partners. Each face seemed to stare down at me with quiet judgment. At the end of the hall hung a massive oil painting of him, seated in the same office chair, wearing the same expression of power. Beneath it was a gold plaque that read, Chief Ibrahim Bello, the Lion of Kano. As a child, I used to be terrified of that painting. Now, as a grown man, I realized I still was. The old mansion had always been more than a home. It was a fortress of history and secrets. Every floorboard creaked with memory. The air carried whispers from a different time, when my grandfather built his empire brick by brick. I could almost see him in his younger days, tall, fierce, with fire in his eyes, turning nothing into everything. When I was a boy, I'd come here during holidays. He'd sit me on his knee and tell stories of how he started selling groundnuts on the dusty streets before he owned warehouses across Africa. But something changed as I grew older. My parents stopped bringing me here. They said Grandpa was different now. Too controlling, too proud. I used to wonder if that pride was the reason my father died broke. Too stubborn to ask his own father for help. I walked into the living room, where old clocks ticked and chandeliers dangled like frozen rain. Everything screamed wealth: carved ivory, imported rugs, golden photo frames, but there was no warmth, just silence and dust. Then I saw it, a small wooden chest by the fireplace, half open. Inside were letters, yellowed with age. One caught my eye. My name, written in Grandpa's handwriting. I hesitated, then opened it. Aminu, if you are reading this, it means you have reached the age when a man must answer for himself. You will be given what is yours, but it will test your heart before your hands. Remember this, wealth is not kept by wisdom alone, but by purpose. Find yours. I folded the letter slowly. The air around me felt heavier. Was this all planned, every word, every silence, even today's question? I thought of how many times I'd cursed fate for my bad luck. Maybe it wasn't fate, maybe it was him, watching from a distance, measuring me like a farmer watching his crops. The sound of footsteps pulled me back. One of the housekeepers, an elderly woman named Mama Rose, entered with a tray of tea. Her eyes were kind but cautious. Chief said you'd be staying the night, she said softly. He doesn't bring people here unless it's important. I looked at her, my voice shaking. Did you know about it? The trust fund. She gave a faint smile, her wrinkled face unreadable. Child, in this house, there are many things known but never spoken. Your grandfather keeps his lessons hidden in silence. As she walked away, I felt the weight of her words. Every corner of this mansion held secrets, and I was finally standing in the middle of them. I looked back at the letter in my hand. Grandpa wasn't just giving me money, he was dragging me into something far older, deeper, a legacy that came with invisible strings. That night, I barely slept. The question kept echoing. How do you spend your $3 million trust fund? And beneath it, another whisper. What kind of man will you become when you finally can? The next morning, sunlight crept through the heavy curtains, painting golden streaks across the marble floor. I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, staring at the same envelope that had ruined my sleep. My thoughts were tangled. $3 million. A test. 1 week. The weight of it pressed on my chest like a stone. I picked up my phone and called my closest friend, Malik. He answered in his usual joking tone, but when I told him what had happened, the laughter died in his throat. Wait, he said, his voice suddenly serious. Your grandfather gave you $3 million. Not exactly, I sighed. He said it's in my name, but I can't touch it yet. I have to tell him how I'd spend it. Malik whistled. Man, that's insane. If it were me, I'd already be on a plane to Dubai. I laughed weakly. That's exactly the kind of answer that would make him disown me. Still, Malik said, you could do a lot with that money. Start a business. Buy land. Change your life. Or destroy it. I muttered. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and searched the trust account name. It was real. Every detail matched the papers in the envelope. Investments in real estate, shares, and offshore accounts all in my name. My head spun. How could I have lived in poverty while this existed quietly, like a buried treasure? I left the mansion and drove into the city, needing air. The streets were loud and chaotic, vendors shouting, taxis honking, music spilling from shops. It was the Africa I knew, alive, unpredictable, full of struggle and spirit. I stopped at a small cafe where I used to work part-time during university. The owner, Baba Tund, recognized me immediately. Aminu, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Still chasing dreams, my boy? I smiled faintly. Trying to, Baba. He sat across from me with 2 cups of tea. Your grandfather is a wise man, he said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. He believes a man must first be poor in the mind before he learns to be rich in the heart. I frowned. You know him. Everyone in this city knows Chief Bello, he said, but few understand him. He builds people, not just buildings. His words stayed with me long after I left the cafe. Maybe Grandpa wasn't just testing me. Maybe he was building something through me. That night, I sat by the mansion's balcony, watching the moonlight pour over the garden. The house seemed less intimidating now, as if waiting for my decision. I thought about what Malik said: business, luxury, travel, but it all felt empty. Then I remembered something my mother used to say: when you have, give; when you don't, still give. Her voice echoed through the quiet night. Maybe the answer wasn't about spending money at all. Maybe it was about what kind of person I'd become with it. I looked at the envelope again, my reflection flickering in the glass window. For the first time, I didn't just see confusion, I saw responsibility staring back. Somewhere deep inside, I knew Grandpa was watching, waiting to see if I'd find the answer he already knew. The following morning, I decided to visit the one person who could help me think clearly: Aunt Zara, my late father's sister. She lived On the outskirts of the city, in a modest house surrounded by mango trees and the smell of earth after rain. When she opened the door, her eyes softened with surprise. "Aminu, my boy, it's been years." She hugged me tightly, her hands trembling slightly. We sat in her small living room, sipping hibiscus tea. I told her everything: Grandpa's question, the trust fund, the 1-week deadline. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled. She murmured. "He's doing it again." "Doing what?" I asked. "Testing his bloodline," she said. "He did it to your father too." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" She took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Your father was offered a business investment by your grandfather, enough money to start his own company. But he refused. He said he'd rather build his life without help. He wanted to prove he could succeed without owing anyone, even his father. And," she looked at me sadly, "he failed. Pride consumed him. When he died, he had debts and dreams, nothing more." I felt a tightness in my chest. "So this is the same test." "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but not the same lesson. Your grandfather is old now, Aminu. He doesn't need you to be rich. He needs you to understand what richness truly means." Her words struck deep. I looked out the window at the children playing in the dusty street, barefoot and laughing. Maybe wealth wasn't meant to isolate me, but to connect me to something bigger. Before I left, Aunt Zara placed a small leather-bound notebook in my hand. "This belonged to your father," she said. "He used to write ideas in it, things he wanted to build for people." I thanked her and drove back to the mansion as twilight spread across the horizon. The roads were quiet and my thoughts louder than ever. When I got to my room, I opened the notebook. The first page read, "A man's wealth should feed more mouths than his own." Page after page, I found sketches of community projects, notes on farming cooperatives, ideas for scholarships, even plans for a youth training center. My father had dreamed of giving back, he just never got the chance. Tears blurred my vision. I realized then that maybe Grandpa wasn't testing me alone. Maybe he was testing whether his son's vision could still live through me. That night, I began writing my plan. Not about cars, houses, or travel, but about people. I wrote of creating opportunities, reviving the community my father loved, and using the fund not as an escape, but as a seed. When I finally put down the pen, it was midnight. The mansion was silent except for the ticking of an old clock. For the first time since this all began, I felt peace. Somewhere in the silence, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice whispering, "Good, now you are beginning to understand." Morning light spilled through the mansion's tall windows as I placed my finished plan on the dining table. The ink was still fresh, the words raw with meaning. For the first time, I felt ready to face my grandfather. Still, fear lingered in my stomach like a shadow that refused to leave. I found him in the garden, sitting beneath the large baobab tree that had stood there since his youth. He was feeding birds with steady, deliberate hands. When he saw me approach, he didn't smile. He only said, "1 week is not over, but I see in your eyes, you've found something." I handed him the notebook and waited. He adjusted his glasses and began to read slowly, his silence cutting deeper with every page. I watched his expression, searching for any sign: approval, disapproval, anything. But his face stayed carved from stone. After what felt like hours, he closed the notebook. He said quietly, "You speak of schools, of farms, of helping others. But tell me, Aminu, do you know what that costs?" "Yes," I replied, forcing confidence into my voice. "But I also know what it saves." He raised a brow. "And what does it save?" "Dignity," I said. "For those who have none left. Hope for those who have stopped believing." For the first time, a faint smile flickered across his face. "You sound like your father." He stood up, leaning on his cane, and began to walk toward the fountain at the center of the garden. "Your father dreamed too much," he said. "Dreams without discipline are dangerous. But maybe you have what he lacked." I followed him quietly. The garden shimmered in the heat, filled with the sounds of distant birds and running water. Grandpa stopped and turned to me. "I will not release the full trust yet," he said. "Not because I doubt you, but because I want to see you act before I believe your words." He pointed to the old family warehouse by the edge of the estate. "Start there. I will release 1/10 of the fund. Use it to begin something real. If you fail, the rest dies with me." My heart pounded. 1/10, $300,000. It was both a blessing and a warning. "I understand," I said quietly, as I turned to leave. His voice followed me, deep and steady. Remember Amunu, money moves fast, but legacy moves slow. Build something that can outlive you. Later that day, I walked into the warehouse. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the smell of oil and wood filled the air. It had once stored Grandpa's trading goods cocoa hides, grains, but now, it would hold something new. I ran my hand over the old wooden beams and whispered, "We'll start here, Father." Ideas began forming rapidly, turning part of it into a small community training center, hiring local youths to restore it, planting fruit trees in the compound to feed the workers. I could almost see it, the place alive with laughter, hope, and work. That night, as I drove home, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I no longer saw the confused man who'd walked into the mansion days ago. I saw a begonia seed just breaking through the soil. And somewhere, I felt my grandfather's gaze, proud but cautious, watching to see if the seed would truly grow. The next weeks unfolded like a storm and a sunrise at once. With the initial funds Grandpa released, I began transforming the old warehouse into something alive. The first step was renovation: broken walls, cracked windows, dust everywhere. I hired local youth from the community, boys and girls who hung around the streets with nothing to do but dream. On the first day, I stood before them in my old jeans and a shirt soaked in sweat, holding a paintbrush instead of a speech. "We're not just fixing a building," I told them. "We're fixing what people forgot: our own potential." They looked at me skeptically, but as the days went by, they worked harder than I expected. Some of them brought music. Others brought laughter. The warehouse that once smelled of decay began to breathe again. Walls were painted in bright colors, windows replaced, floors scrubbed until they shone. The locals began to take notice. An old man from the next compound stopped by one afternoon and said, "Your grandfather used to store his goods here. Now you're storing hope. That's how legacy works, son." His words filled me with quiet pride. When the renovation finished, I named the place the Seed House. It would be a center for vocational training, carpentry, tailoring, digital skills, and small business management. I partnered with a few old friends who had experience in tech and education. One of them, Halima, left her job to help coordinate classes. We held our first meeting in the newly restored hall, the air smelling of fresh paint and ambition. "We're not waiting for the government," I told them. "We're going to teach people how to build their own doors when none are open." By the second month, dozens of young people had registered. Some came from distant neighborhoods, walking miles each morning just to learn. I watched them with a mix of awe and fear. What if I failed them? What if Grandpa had been right to doubt me? But then, something remarkable began to happen. The small tailoring group sold their first batch of handmade shirts in the local market. The carpentry trainees built desks and benches for nearby schools. The digital class designed a local business website and got paid for it. The Seed House was no longer an idea, it was a pulse in the heart of the city. When I went back to the mansion to show Grandpa the photos, he didn't say anything at first. He stared at the pictures, smiling youths, repaired walls, busy workshops, then at me. "You built all this with 1/10, he finally asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "And it's only the beginning." He leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "You've done well. But remember, Aminu, success is the easiest part. Keeping your soul pure after success, that's the real challenge." His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. I understood what he meant. I was about to be tested again, not by poverty this time, but by temptation. As I left the mansion that evening, the golden sky burned with the promise of a storm. And deep inside, I knew the real trial hadn't even started yet. The storm came, just as I'd feared, not with thunder or rain, but with people. When word spread that I had access to my grandfather's money, the vultures arrived. Old friends I hadn't heard from in years began calling, all speaking in sweet tones, pretending to care. "Aminu, brother. So proud of you. You know, I have this business idea." Some even showed up at my office, smiling too wide, laughing too loud. At first, I helped where I could. I thought generosity was strength. But soon I realized generosity without boundaries was weakness. Then came family, distant cousins, uncles, even my mother's sisters, children, each with a story of need. Hospital bills, school fees, a wedding to fund. Every day brought another knock at my door, another plea dressed in emotion. I wanted to help them all, but I was drowning in guilt and exhaustion. The Seed House began to suffer. Workers waited for delayed payments. Supplies ran low. My focus shifted from the dream to the noise. Malik, my old friend, noticed it first. He confronted me one evening at the training center. "You're losing it? Man, You've turned into a walking wallet. That's not what we started this for." His words hit me like cold water. "Their family, Malik," I protested weakly. He looked at me sharply. "Then help them the right way. Don't feed their greed, teach them to grow." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the quiet halls of the seed house. The murals on the walls painted by the youth seemed to watch me, whispering a reminder of why I began this in the first place. The next morning, I decided to make changes. I called a community meeting. Everyone gathered in the courtyard: students, workers, curious neighbors. I stood before them and spoke from my heart. I built this place to give chances, not handouts. I've learned that money can destroy as quickly as it builds. From today, no one will receive cash from me again, but anyone willing to work, to learn, to earn, I will stand beside you. The reaction was mixed, some angry, some silent, but most inspired. Within days, new ideas bloomed. The tailoring team proposed making uniforms for nearby schools. The carpenters offered to train teenagers for free. The seed house had evolved from a charity into a living ecosystem. Weeks later, Grandpa summoned me again. I walked into his study with calm confidence this time. He looked older, but his eyes were still fierce. "You've faced the first danger of wealth greed from others," he said. "Now comes the second grade from within." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward. "Pride, my boy. Success can make you forget humility faster than poverty ever could." I nodded silently, feeling his words settle deep inside. He smiled faintly. "I see my son's fire in you, but not his recklessness. You've done well, Aminu. It's time we speak of the rest of the fund." My pulse quickened. Was this it, the moment he'd finally hand over control of everything? But before he could continue, his hand trembled. The cane slipped from his grasp, clattering against the marble floor. "Grandpa," I shouted, rushing to his side. His face had gone pale, his breath shallow. He looked up at me weakly and whispered, "Don't be afraid. Even lions must rest." And in that moment, I knew the story was about to change forever. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and sorrow. Machines hummed softly, their blinking lights the only movement in the stillness of the room. Grandpa lay there, pale but composed, the weight of his 90 years resting heavy on his chest. I sat beside him, my hands clenched around his. For the first time in my life, the Lion of Kono looked small. Days blurred into each other, nurses moving quietly, doctors whispering in hallways, family members gathering like shadows. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, but I was the only one who understood what he was truly waiting for. Me. On the third day, he opened his eyes. "You came," he murmured. His voice was weak, but his gaze was still sharp. "I never left," I said softly. He smiled faintly. "Good, you learned loyalty. A rare thing these days." He gestured for me to come closer. I leaned in until his breath warmed my ear. "Do you remember what I told you? Money moves fast, but legacy moves slow." "Yes," I whispered. He nodded. "Then listen carefully. The trust fund was never the real gift. The money, 3 million, 10 million, it's only paper. What I truly built for you is something you cannot spend." I frowned. "I don't understand." His hand trembled as he pointed toward the small leather briefcase on the side table. "Open it." Inside was a single document, a transfer of ownership deed for the Bello Holdings estate, the mansion, and all its assets. Beneath it, another paper, an official letter appointing me as the new chairman of his foundation. I looked up at him in shock. "Grandpa, I can't." He raised a finger weakly, silencing me. "You can, because you proved you'd use it for others, not for yourself. You passed the test, Aminu." Tears welled in my eyes. I only did what I thought was right. He smiled, eyes glistening. "That's what makes it right." He took a shallow breath, each word now a struggle. "Promise me you'll keep building the seed house. Make it the root of something greater. Teach them not just how to earn, but how to live. That's the true wealth of Africa war people." "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "Good, then my work is done." The heart monitor beeped steadily for a few seconds longer, then fell silent. The lion had finally rested. Weeks later, the mansion was quieter than ever. The funeral drew people from across the country: politicians, business leaders, villagers, and students. Everyone had a story of how Chief Bello had touched their lives. But as they spoke of his empire, I realized that what he left behind wasn't just money or property. It was a blueprint for purpose. After the ceremony, I returned to the seed house. The youth had gathered there, candles lit, singing softly in his memory. On one of the walls, someone had painted a new mural: Grandpa's face beside the words, "Wealth dies, but wisdom breathes forever." I stood there for a long time, letting the words sink in. Then, quietly, I said to them, the foundation will continue. We're expanding the seed house to new cities. This is just the beginning. The crowd cheered, but I felt no pride, only peace. Later that night, I sat alone under the same baobab tree where Grandpa used to feed birds. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the familiar scent of home. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Now I understand. Grandpa, you weren't asking how I'd spend your money, you were asking how I'd spend my life." A single bird landed on the branch above, chirping softly as if answering. And in that moment, I knew he was still watching, still teaching, still proud.